I'm Corey Hayden. I'm the director of the center, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce today's visitor, Dr. Philip Campbell, who's the editor-in-chief of the journal Nature. Many of you in the audience are here, I'm imagining, because you know, we all know, that the world of scientific publishing, as with publishing in adjacent fields, is undergoing some quite consequential seismic shifts, whether we talk about the growing institutionalization of open access models and the PLOS journals, or the new Reproducibility initiative launched quite recently, or the questions of how big data might transform how we publish, how we think about, how we structure crucial institutions around knowledge production, such as peer review itself. I think it's fair to say that understanding how knowledge is authorized, verified, how it circulates well, is a question that's shared passionately by science studies scholars, by scientists, by journals, and by our various publics. And there's probably no one better placed right now to help us understand the shape of these contemporary transformations than Philip Campbell. Dr. Campbell has a bachelor's in sciences in aeronautical engineering from the University of Bristol, a master's in science in astrophysics from Queen Mary and Westfield College at the University of London, and a PhD in upper atmospheric physics from the University of Leicester. He began working at Nature in 1979 and was appointed physical sciences editor in 1982. He then left, I hope I get all these details correct, you can challenge me if I miss anything here. After leaving the journal in 1988, he started the publication called Physics World, and then returned to Nature as editor-in-chief in 1995. And I learned something quite surprising, that you are then only the 7th editor-in-chief since the journal was launched in 1869. That seems important. Dr. Campbell has also worked with the Office of Science and Innovation in the UK, the European Commission, and the US National Institutes of Health. He's a trustee of the charity Cancer Research UK, and among many other things, the chairman of the charity's Public Policy Advisory Group. Again, I think Dr. Campbell brings with him a really unique perspective on the way that publishing itself becomes a window into the relationship between science and the public. And I'm really delighted to welcome him here today. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Corey. Going to do this?
Yes.
I hope you'll be able to hear me at the back. Is that okay if I speak like this? This is just to apparently record me.
Yes, this has no discernible impact.
So I can't deny what I said.
There you are.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I hope that's okay. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. And I will just mention that Berkeley is one of the places I've visited frequently over the years. I think I know the campus better than I know the University of London, because as anybody knows, you want to go and visit exotic, far-off places more than you want to stay on your home turf. But actually, seriously, it's because in the University of California system generally, but especially in Berkeley, A, there's plenty of papers that we publish coming out of the labs here, and B, in areas where I've tried to grow Nature's coverage, especially recently in the social sciences. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there have been people here who I've come to visit alongside many others. So I'll say more about some of that later on, and of course you can ask about it and challenge and do whatever you want afterwards. So the topic of the talk is a very big one, enhancing value, reproducibility and access, challenges in scientific publishing. Enhancing value is something that we've always done, we hope, but we're under pressure to show that we're adding value more than I think we've ever been. The reproducibility of research results has become a hot issue recently, and it's taking up a lot of editorial time, and quite rightly. And the challenges of access, everyone on this campus, I'm sure, is very familiar with some of the debates about that, and I'll say a few words about that, although for me, there isn't a debate. So, the traditional model of publishing, I'll start with a bit of an overview of what I see as some of the issues facing publishing generally. The traditional publishing model that we have is these journals. These are the research journals that we publish, but we also have review journals and so on. But that's about the last thing I'm going to say, I hope, about our own publishing. Everything I'm trying to say here is generic. It isn't just related to the Nature Publishing Group, although obviously in some cases some of the things we've done are particularly visible. I do want to mention an online publication that we have, which is our step of the Nature branded journals that we publish into the open access world, in the sense that this is the only Nature branded journal so far that is hybrid. And by hybrid I mean a journal that allows authors the option of publishing their papers in a way that is made absolutely free to all readers the moment they're published, for the payment of a charge, which in this case, in this journal's case, is $5,000. And there are licensing conditions attached to that, which are sometimes contested, and that I think in the end will also settle down as a standard model for everybody. Not necessarily what we're doing, but I think that's part of this arena where gradually publishers and others are I think, getting to a point. It's still going to take a few years, in my view, where the model under which primary research is published is pretty much agreed. That's an extremely optimistic statement, I have to say, when I talk to some people, but I do think we're getting there. There is another aspect of publishing that's happening where we are in, but where I'll give absolute credit to PLOS ONE, the Public Library of Sciences journal, that was the pioneer of this model, which is what I call minimum threshold publishing. And by that I mean that in this journal, at least the way they described themselves when they set it up, they would have no threshold of importance. You can publish a paper in this journal provided it's scientifically valid and it's been peer-reviewed. And the fee, I think, is about $1,000. I can't remember the exact number, but maybe people here who publish there and who can tell us. And scientific reports is, if you like, an imitation of that. It's a form of flattery, if you want, in the sense that we do think it's a valid model. Actually, I will just mention in passing something that I was talking to the editorial director of PLOS ONE just recently, Damien Pattinson, and we agreed that both scientific reports and PLOS ONE have an interesting, if you like, problem, which is that the editorial board, this journal, unlike the Nature journals, has purely external editorial boards, is, if you like, afflicted by editors wanting to make the journal important. So the idea of this thing is that it's not important, that as long as it's valid, this is a repository, it's a database for scientific primary publishing. Too many editors think of PLOS as a brand that needs, quality in terms of impact, and too many editors of PLOS ONE, of scientific reports, see the Nature company that it's a part of as requiring a threshold of importance. And where this matters is something that we're going to hear later on, which is that there are some certain types of papers which may be just replications of existing work that have a value and that will be seen as unimportant by certain standards. And yet, this is exactly the sort of journal where you should at least be able to publish in this journal, if in nowhere else. And it's proving difficult. It's proving difficult to attract those papers, it's true to say, but also, when you do get them, the editors tend to get snooty about them. So it's just an interesting reflection on the dynamics of editorial boards. Whatever publishers may say, editorial boards tend to have a sort of collective mind of their own. Now, open access publishing more generally, I just want to say that the Nature titles, other than Nature Communications, including Nature itself, I'm sure they will go hybrid. I wouldn't be at all surprised within the long run whether they're pure gold in terms of the papers they publish. By pure gold, I mean this model called Gold Open Access, where you pay, it's immediately available in its final form. The licensing makes it completely reusable by anybody under any circumstances. I'm personally convinced, as an editor, I don't have publishing responsibility, so it's easier for me to say this than the publishers, but at the same time, I think it'll happen. Nevertheless, the constraining factor on that is that the funding for this, the author's fees, which are going to be required, have to come from funding agencies. And although the take-up of the open access option by authors on Nature Communications has been pretty healthy, it's about 40%, which is much higher than we anticipated, they're finding that money, as far as we can tell, from the bits of their grants. And of course, some disciplines don't have this grant structure, but they're just able to get the money together. It's a Nature-branded publication, they're motivated to do it. And so they find the money. But if you're having a system-wide setup like this, the funding agencies need to commit real money to support that system. If you talk to many of the funding agencies, especially in the US, they're not ready to do that. So my impression of what's going on is that it's going to take time for this dialogue that is happening between the funding agencies and the publishers to work its way out. Whether or not there will be in the mix scope for papers in very highly selective journals, which you pay a much bigger author fee than $5,000, is yet to be resolved, but that's not, I wouldn't rule that out. Remember, such papers are a small fraction of the totality of the literature, So if you're looking at a national budget for this sort of stuff, you're talking about a small proportion of the papers you're funding being very expensive. So that's one way forward. You have a different model with PLOS, where PLOS 1 is subsidizing the more expensive journals. And so how that all works out, it's going to be a mix of different companies, different publishers, different learned societies, trying different models with different funding agencies, different disciplines. So it's quite a complex picture. I reckon it's going to take a few years, but I do see the debate being fundamentally over, in that I do think everyone can see the virtue of moving in this direction for primary research, for primary papers. So the editorial resource, I wanted to say a little bit about that, and then about how publishers add value. So Nature and research journals, we have this model, and Nature's always had this model, where the decisions about what papers we publish, and most of this talk is about papers and that part of our job. It is not about the magazine parts of the journal. I'm very happy to talk about that. But the talk is about the publishing of research papers above all. For that task alone, the Nature and research journals have about 100 chief editors and research editors among them. And those are the people who take the final decisions about what we publish. These journals, Nature Communications, Nature Genetics, Nature Immunology, and Nature, all of those journals are the final arbiters of what they choose to publish, with, of course, input from peer review. We have review journals with about 50 commissioning editors. We have various journals where we have magazine staff on them with editors and reporters. And we have copy editors, the back office, the administration, the production. All of these are sources of added value, and I think are widely recognized as such out there, at least for some of the journals. And so the question is, what are they actually doing? So just to quickly say something about the Nature editors, as I say, we've never had an editorial board. We have 25 full-time editors whose only job is to assess the papers that get sent to us. They're recruited from successful postdocs or faculty. They're selected for their ability to comprehend and access across a discipline and beyond. So we actually test them for their ability to do that. They come from all nationalities. They come from all the disciplines in the natural sciences. They are expected not only to sit in their office, and when they sit in their office, they're assessing not only the papers that are submitted, but related papers that they can find in the literature. But also they go out on extended visits and meetings every year, plus shorter trips, of course. So they're spending about 6 weeks out there just meeting people, visiting conferences, developing and keeping an overview of how their field is developing, keeping an overview of who's doing interesting work, etc., etc. We get 11,000 submissions per year to Nature of papers, and each editor is therefore considering about 10 per week. And we'll reject about 65% of them immediately, i.e. within a week, hopefully, purely based on our judgment of what we think is important in scientific terms. Purely scientific terms, I would say. There's a slight qualification on that, but mainly scientific. We referee the rest, and of the total of submissions, we accept about 8%. And incidentally, the research journals all have similar figures. So a paper that's a strong contender for review, it'll address an interesting question, it'll have strong, well-controlled data. If it's an experimental paper, it'll rule out alternative explanations. It'll have speculation in it, but it shouldn't go beyond what the data really permits. The discussion will put the paper in perspective, and above all, it'll provide some sort of strong insight or other scientific value. So traditionally, we were very hot on insisting on mechanistic insight into something, whatever it is we're looking at. Now we're a little bit more relaxed about if this is a purely technical innovation and yet is going to suddenly empower a lot of people. We'd be very positive about that. If it's just producing a monumental resource of data, interaction pathways, whatever, that sort of stuff, even without coming to some sort of grand conclusion, we would certainly consider that sort of work. The peer reviewing process, every paper will be seen by, I would say, on average, about 3 reviewers, and they each get this sort of guidance. How many of them read them? This guidance, I don't know, but it's important to us that we've given them the guidance, that they look for the originality, they look for the data, they look at the statistics, they look at the conclusions' robustness, they look at suggested improvements. If they're going to say this is not original, they give the citation so we understand that, and they make comments about the clarity. And I have to say, I think on the whole, we do have good quality refereeing reports. I'm sure there'll be some authors who disagree with that, of course, and no doubt there are occasions where we're not as good as we should be. But on the whole, I think we get good feedback about the value that this process adds to the paper from the authors that we publish. So a good reviewer will not only provide a good review, but also sometimes or often involve younger colleagues. I always want to emphasize that. You've got to keep this tradition of peer review going. just in principle, whether it's for journals or grant funding or committees set up for tenure or for appointments, peer review is an integral part of the process. And so nurturing high standards in the next generation of peer reviewers is something that's very important. There is an issue out there about the pressure on people's time. I have to say that we're privileged in this respect because the papers we send out tend to be interesting papers. People like being peer reviewers of the nature journals, so we are privileged in the sense that they're more likely to say yes when we ask them. And of course, there's a bit of a return for that, if you're lucky, that we will give them some credit for that, and I'll say a little bit more later about how we try to do that. But the key thing, the key moment for us is when we make the final decision on a paper where we've got referees' reports, and we often face contradictory reviewers' recommendations. By this I mean, of course, if a referee is saying, this is technically flawed and here's why, it's out the door. But if they say, because they've got diverse technical expertises, diverse conceptual backgrounds, they're looking at these papers on their own terms, and they say, this just doesn't feel like an important paper to me, this doesn't feel like the sort of paper Nature should be publishing, nevertheless, it's our job to make that judgment. And we do, and we will sometimes reject referees' recommendations, and on occasion, not very often, but on occasion, all three referees, let's say, will have said, we just don't think this is an important paper, and Nature, in our judgment, it's not appropriate for Nature, and the editor has overruled all those referees and published it. And on the whole, when we've done that, the results in terms of the feedback about the paper, the citations it gets, has been good. So I stand by, in fact, those are some of my sort of favorite moments, if you like, where we actually go against all other people's judgment and go for it. Of course, I'm sure you will find papers that we rejected that then turn out to be successful, and there will be sometimes papers that we publish which are absolutely dreadful, it turns out. And I'll say a little bit about that later on. Sometimes we have to make strategic decisions about what we want to encourage in Nature. So obviously where a field is growing naturally, we will need to look at that, and we will make sure we're getting abreast of it to make sure whether or not we want to publish what aspects of it and so on. But actually what's more interesting is when we act as sort of patrons in a sense and decide that this is a field that even though it's not getting a lot of attention, we think we should be growing it. I've taken a particular stand recently on that in the field of psychiatric disorders, where although the biology itself is making really quite striking advances, nevertheless there's a general sense in which some of that research is not given as much priority as I and colleagues think it should be. So we've actually made a bit of a move in terms of the papers we publish to encourage that, as well as in the discussions in the front half and reviews that we've commissioned and so on. So that's just an example of where we've actually taken a bit of a stand in terms of just encouraging. So within the journals, we visit the labs and the meetings, we publish the review articles and editorials about those areas we want to encourage. And the publishers may go so far as to start a new journal in the area they want to encourage. So over the years, I've pushed these disciplines, physics, genomics in the very early days, malaria, where there was a time before the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stepped in, when malaria was an orphan topic, and we published the genome of the parasite, and we thought we should really push the discipline. And I think we had a bit of an impact, but nothing like what Bill and Melinda Gates have done. And then the social sciences more recently, true not so much in the publishing of papers. That's a different topic, and I can come back to that. And then, as I said, in psychiatric disorders. So what will we add value to? So, people in the open access debates, people say the public have funded it, the public have the right to access to it, which I think in many people's eyes is an unarguable point, but you have to ask the question, what is it? And what the public would want access to, and every scientist would like access to, is stuff that's usable and that has had some sort of quality control. So that's where the publishers hopefully come in. So what I'm now talking about is this added value that we're bringing over and above the selection process and the peer review process and the revision process that I've just talked about. So what I want to talk about now is about how the literature itself might evolve. And I use that word might because you can have every vision in the world as to just how rich life could be, and then you find that unfortunately prosaic things like budgetary crises and stuff get in the way, and sheer interdisciplinary, what do you want to call it, intransigence or culture differences or whatever. And I'm not just talking about academic disciplines, I'm talking about the sectors out there who have to work together to bring some of this literature to fruition. Anyway, here is a standard Nature paper. It's a flat object. It's the PDF or the printed version. We've all moved beyond that because we have the online HTML version of papers, which, at least at the moment, is what I would call the definitive version, because that's got everything in it that you can get hold of in association with that paper. So moving away from, well, not away from that, but sort of into a world in the future where this guy, Jim Gray, who died not so long ago, he was one of the visionaries at Microsoft, came up with this idea that the entire scientific literature is this vat. And it exists in terms of all the sorts of stuff that's out there, experiments, other archives, grey literatures, as well as peer-reviewed literature, computer models, it's all out there, all there. And this vat should be accessible to people, and you should just query it like the natural world. You know, it's a sort of a simulacrum of the natural world, our understanding of the natural world. And you should just put in a question, and somehow out will pop an answer. And so the generic problems then are how you organize that, how do you make it happen, etc. And publishers are excited by that as a vision in general, I would say, at least some of us are. And the depressing thing is just how far away it still is, despite having been thinking about it for years. I mean, Jim Gray was one who articulated in a way that I think got a lot of people thinking a few years ago, but more generally, people could see this coming as a vision some time ago. So the vision itself is this edifice of text and numbers and equations and data and software and images, graphics, videos, tables, annotations, and metadata. And it's seamless and hyperdimensional. You can explore it in all sorts of different dimensions. It's readable, searchable, and computable by humans and machines. It's checked and ranked by editors and crowds. It's sourced from journals, labs, community databases, institutional databases, meta-analyses, grey literatures. It's underpinned by community standards of nomenclature, annotation, sharing, and integrity, both technical integrity, which I'll come on to, and ethical integrity. It's free to all users, and it's financially sustainable. So that's a nice little challenge for us all. So how does a publisher of primary research add value? And this applies not only today, but should apply to all those elements that I was talking about going forward. So I've discussed the selectivity, at least of the nature model. The editing, of course, we have to edit, but edit is not just about language. Every time you're using something online, you're able to use it, you're able to navigate it, because some editor somewhere, or an author, but usually editors, have added in a little bit of metadata which tell the coding of the source file that this is a gene, or this is whatever it is you're looking for. And that's an increasing part of what the publishers are doing, adding signifiers within the text that then allow search engines or other machines, artificial intelligence, the semantic web in the long run, in terms of trying to work out what this thing is telling us. How can I quickly get through all this morass of papers to find out what the messages are? Okay, so publishers will also distribute and make visible via print, online, mobile, indexing. It'll enhance, a publisher should enhance discoverability by these metadata and providing navigation, adding context and comments in some cases, amplification to society via the media in some cases. Permanence and credit is a natural outcome of this process. It's not the only way you can get it, but it should be one of the key ways, that you have a permanent record in durable online formats and you get credit. Again, I'll come back to that in a minute. And assisting the scientific community is also part of the publisher's job in helping give credit and be accountabilities, i.e. relating a paper to the funding that funded it, getting into, if you need to cross-reference ethical issues that lie behind some of the data, being able to get to those. Contribution to the strategic thinking of the community. We engage with scientists and funding agencies to talk about standards of metadata or very prosaic publishing issues or more longer-term strategic issues. And then finally providing tools that assist researchers in their publishing and lab activities. So that's what we're doing at the moment, and the question is how that's going to evolve. I don't see any of those tasks changing or going away by any means, but the things we're applying it to are changing. So we have the traditional remit of the publication in the center there, all those things I've talked about, but there's a pre-publication where your publishers, I see opportunities which may be mirages of helping scientists to network, of helping them discover stuff, in helping them plan their work, and thinking about their work, working with peers if they've discovered some new technique and they want to explore with other people how those techniques work so they can plan their next experiment. A lot of publishers, including us, would see that as an opportunity area, and not necessarily incidentally to make money, because sometimes just by getting people involved, they become potential customers. So there's a sort of, it's not PR, it's a hook, if you like, to get people into your landscape. And provided you're genuinely providing a service, that itself can be a good thing for the publisher. Post-publication, making data discoverable and reusable, helping to broadcast, providing metrics on the article so people can see what the impact of this has been by whatever measure you decide. But it's not only us who are going to be increasingly needing to add value. So researchers are not much interested in post-publication peer review, according to the evidence. If you look at how many people are now commenting online, it's very, very few. But if you look at some blogs, some individual voices out there can be very influential. And of course, there are some organizations like Faculty of 1,000, which are a commercial entity which actually gets people to comment after publication in a systematic way. So how that's going to go, nobody knows. Funding agencies, they need to provide, in my view anyway, the funds for the infrastructure and the author fees for open access, if that's what they want. But for things like data, if they have funded data, it's arguable that they are some of the people who need to provide the funding for that data to be made reusable. And I was talking to a climate modeler, actually, not so much data in his case, a climate modeler, and he's got a model that other people should in principle be able to validate and to check, and he applied for a DOE grant of $300,000, which is what he reckoned it would cost just to make it usable by other people. And he was turned down. So his model sits where it sits. And of course, people can go and visit him, but it's not the same as just making it, putting it out there. So the demands on funding agencies are only going to grow in terms of what scientists would like to do, assuming that public funding is really the key place to go in order to support this. The universities and research institutions, their libraries and their IT departments providing repositories and information tools and data planning, etc., etc. Researchers themselves will add value by exploiting Google, Facebook, websites. But none of these roles are necessarily going to be adopted easily, and which is why I'm talking about years as a timescale for some of these inevitable things to happen. I think it is frustrating for publishers that scientists seem the least willing to get involved on social networks, incidentally. That just doesn't seem to fit. I'm not saying they don't use Facebook or Twitter for certain purposes, but in terms of their professional lives, I'm sure they are networking, but in terms of providing facilities for them, I think the market signals, if I can use that phrase, is that actually scientists sort of don't really want to get into that terrain. They don't want to comment publicly about other people's work. So, there's a sort of closeted nature to research, which publishers and researchers perhaps need to explore a little bit to see whether publishers can help them. Okay, so if I think about the things that we are having to think about, data and tools and post-publication impacts, things I've mentioned, the sheer growth of data, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. That's just the red line is the gradual increase in the primary papers being published. These are those deposited in PubMed, I think, so they're biomedical. And then you have all these exponentially growing curves of various types of biological data. So that just highlights the challenge. I wanted to give you an example of how these conversations and things are developing. The details don't matter, you'll be glad to know. But this is a workshop that happened late last year. It was at Harvard, hosted by Harvard and Microsoft, and attended by publishers, academics, technology companies, small ones like Mendeley, as well as big ones like Microsoft and Google, and journal editors and so on. And the headings of the agenda were tools that we need to develop in order to help scientists do stuff. So project collaboration software, smart laboratory software. So the people engaged in developing just widgets and gadgets, not necessarily products, were Oxford, that's misprint, Oxford's University, Harvard Medical School, and Elsevier. Another strand of this was looking at the production and distribution and archiving of non-standard media like videos, 3D models, and so on. And again, you had a UCSD there, an editor of a journal, a director of a citizen science, and a research programmer at Wolfram. And so all these other stats, things like how to give credit for research, software that will help you do that, how to best enable cooperation. These are things where this melange of interest groups are talking to each other. Publishers, some of them anyway, are in there, just trying to make sense of it all and to see where opportunities are. I just wanted to mention a paper that I'm not going to spend time on this, where this idea that a paper comes with tools to use the paper is sort of growing, and this was just an example where we published this particular paper, but in order to understand the data, you really had to use the tool that was hosted at the Liebherr Institute for Brain Development, which produced it. So you are dependent on the institute providing a tool that actually is going to allow you to really interpret the data. So what sort of permanence does that have? Not clear. It's a very well-funded, philanthropically funded institute, the Liebherr Institute, so one can have a reasonable amount of confidence, but that's just an example of the sort of game you have to get into with very complex data. So I now want to turn to the issue of researchers' credit. So I think we at Nature Publishing Group certainly see it as a goal to try and maximize the credit authors can get from simply using or publishing in or engaging with whatever we're doing. So the authors of papers and other research texts, what sort of ways are there to give them credit? The scientific contributors more generally in terms of data and tools, referees, and then in their role as educators and communicators. How to sort of sharpen up the way in which individual contributions are appreciated. So this was just launched. This is a thing referred to as ORCID. It's the Open Research and Contributor ID. And I applied and I got my ID, which is this 16-digit number, and totally unmemorable, but the point is I now exist as a unique person in the scientific firmament, and everybody can. And so if you think of someone like the name of John Smith or Chen Wen or whatever, and there may be many others like with that name around the world, this actually instantly takes you to the right person. Once they have signed up to the database, they've entered their information, you can instantly see when you see their name in a paper, but you also see the identifier, and you click on the identifier, you immediately get to that person, and you can see. And in that database, it gives you an opportunity to upload your own publications, the grants you may have received, any patents you've got. It's a potential way to just make more visible what this person is, who has signed this particular paper. So that is something who is well supported by a collaboration of funding agencies and publishers and others. Exactly where it's going to go, it's too early to tell, but we've certainly signed up to it, and many other publishers are sort of going to incorporate this particular identifier as part. If you register on our website, you're already now being asked to, you don't have to, but it's there if you want to register. So, you know, you just get your identity clearer. If you're an author on our paper, you will have the opportunity, if you wish, to make sure you do have your ORCID identifier. We just think that's a good thing. Refereeing credit, anyone who's reviewed for a Nature journal now can now obtain, and this again was a recent development, just a formal statement that says, you know, we want to thank you for your work as a reviewer. You have helped us publish, and we don't give the details of the papers, but we do say how many times they've published, how many times they've refereed across the Nature journals over the last year or whatever period, and that's something they can then take to whoever they want as a piece of credit to show to their employer or their group head or their funding agency or whatever, as part of their contribution to science. The author contribution statement is something that has become interesting to me. So this was pioneered by the biomedical journals, or rather the medical journal, not the biomedical, the medical journals. And here's just an example of what we do, and I think this is pretty standard. I mean, there are some journals that formalize it. We haven't so far. So this happens to be a physics paper. All those authors are there. And if you look at the end of the paper, you find what is now obligatory if you're publishing in a Nature journal, which is the contributions. And you can just see it just tells who does what in a very outline way. There's no particular guideline for this. We allow people to be very vague if they choose to be. We know that in some collaborations it's really hard to tease this all out, and you can get into difficulties. So we've been completely tolerant of however people want to describe it. If you have huge collaborations, they've found ways, some of them, of summarizing it in a neat way. It's all there online. So here it is. It's just telling you what they've done. So to me, a question is this something that's going to grow in attraction? If you have your name on a paper with multiple people, and you want to be seen more specifically what you did, should we make the contribution statement something a little bit more formal, a little bit more clear as to exactly what was happening? How should that change is a question we're currently looking at. Why would you do that? It allows increased credit for what specifically was done, and it also allows increased accountability for potential flaws in the work, because it becomes clear who did this particular part of the work, and that somebody needs to go back to them. Actually, something I didn't list there, it also highlights if you're the person who worked on a particular technique, that you are the expert to go to in that collaboration, and if there's a little group of people who want to gather their expertise in a technique, it's nice to know specifically who used that technique and is seen as the expert. So how useful that'll be, I can't be sure. How granular that information should become, and how formal it should become as a requirement and usable therefore by others, because we don't vet it at all, it's all taken on trust. So it's just something that's out there, and I can see real reasons for it to not get any more burdensome, but at the same time to help people get the credit and the accountability that probably there should be there. So I think I'm heading towards the final stage of my talk. I can't remember, but it will get there. So what follows research published in Nature was a question that I thought it was worth discussing. So once you've published your paper, what happens? The key issue here, which I will focus on a little bit more detail, is the reproducibility of research, as I said at the beginning. This is a real topic which is occupying a lot of people. But there are other things more generally that happen that are worth just dwelling on. So there's citations in the scientific and patent literature, there's discussion in society, there's fame and fortune or notoriety, and there are technological applications. So looking at some of those, the citations in the scientific literature, I think is worth just looking at a little bit more closely. So this graph is the ranking of citation numbers of papers published in Nature, Science and Cell, ranked from the top highly cited paper right at the left, and then just, by diminishing order of citation. And this is the top 100 papers in each of these journals, published in 2010, with their citations measured in November 2011. And so what you have there is, in Nature, there was a paper with 300 citations, which is the most highest cited at that time, and then you get this long tail, which goes on for another 700 papers. Similarly for Science, which publishes a similar number. Similarly for Cell, which publishes, I think, fewer, but it doesn't matter. That's the general shape of the curve, and the point that is always worth making if you're somebody who thinks about impact factors is that impact factors are hugely dominated, if you look at the way the numbers work, by this set of papers. So I did a calculation about 5 years ago, and it turned out that I can't remember the exact number now, I'm afraid, but it was something like 80% of the impact factor came from about 20% of the papers. So it's a huge skew, if you like, if you're going to judge a journal by its impact factor. Nevertheless, I mean, it is a measure of a journal. But the key thing I want to say is, if you look at the entire spectrum, so these are all of them, right? And the fact that Nature's spectrum is slightly higher than all the others is just a coincidence. I thought it'd be nevertheless interesting to include it. If you then look at the papers themselves, you see, here are the genomic sequencing of human microbiome, and in 2010, one of our most highly cited papers, and there are other papers which are the sort of things you would expect, pluripotent stem cells, etc., to be highly cited. But the point I always like to make is that it's these papers that we also value just as much. We publish these papers, they've had 1 or 2 citations, some of these are right at the other end of the curves, and yet no one is saying, at least not on Nature, that these are less important, right, in terms of the fact that they have their own scientific interest, their own value. So why they're cited less? Some seem puzzlingly small, and we haven't yet looked into those, and I'm thinking we might, but it all takes work. This is the physical sciences equivalent. So again, you've got nanocrystals, you've got graphene up there, very hot topics. But again, you look at the very low citations, and you'll see the construction of a particular structure on Mars, the waves on the surface of the Orion molecular cloud. These are really esoteric topics which are interesting in scientific terms, but which aren't necessarily going to change the world. There aren't a lot of people who are going to need to refer to that, but they're all gems. So that's just a point I like to make, that citations are far from being the goal that we pursue, even though it's nice to be high up in the impact factor league or top. So other things that happen after you've published: you get media coverage. We have a very good media operation. We hope that that the press releases we supply are reasonably accurate and free of hype, and we ask reporters to tell us if they think we've hyped papers. Some of them are very critical, critically minded, I should say. Somebody was bestowed a chair at Stanford very much I mean, Stanford was bestowed the chair, and the person who inspired the chair got the chair. So, but that came out of a particular paper that appeared in Nature. If you're in Chinese labs and in other parts of the world, you get very big pay bonuses if you publish in high-impact journals. People have said if you get one Nature paper, it's equivalent to 1 million euros of a grant in certain parts of Europe. And, of course, companies have been founded on the basis of papers. Is that all good? No, not necessarily at all. I'm just telling you that, that that's the stuff that's out there. We have the frauds to deal with. One of the things that I wish we can change, and I'm hoping we can change, is that English libel laws put all the burden of proof that you have not libeled somebody, that you have not defamed them unfairly, on the media who may be making an accusation about somebody, which is completely opposite to the burden of proof over here and in many other countries. So it can get very expensive, as we recently discovered. We won a case, but it cost well over £1 million to defend it. That was in journalism, I should stress, where it's very easy for people to sue you. And so a lot of universities, as well as journals, are very hesitant to start publishing explanations of a retraction that say, and the reason this is retracted is because X did a fraud. Even when it's the outcome of a university investigation, we've sometimes been advised by lawyers not to publish it because it's been known that the victim is threatening to sue the university, and so on and so forth. I think our job is to keep the literature clean. To give the explanation of the problems in the literature is a separate job. The more we can do to do that, of course, the better. The only other thing I wanted to highlight in the frauds business is something that is never worth not saying, if you see what I mean. I mean, you always need to say it. But the big cases of fraud, Huang on stem cells, Schoen in physics, where many papers had to be retracted in Schoen's case, key papers had to be retracted in Huang. In both cases, subsequent studies showed that it was the duty of co-authors to have prevented those frauds by paying more attention to the data that were being produced on which those papers were based. And I mean, that's the headline as I interpreted it. So I think that's an issue that is still with us, not because there is a growth in frauds, but just because it is a real issue. As collaborations get bigger and bigger, it is easy for people, if they really choose, to abuse all the trust that there is in laboratories and in the journal system and produce fraudulent results. And the temptations to do so must be growing because the pressures and the competitiveness are there. So to come to the final section of what I want to talk about, it's what else happens post-publication. So there's discussion and there's refutation. Well, you know, everyone says a key part of the scientific process is replication of the results, and if it's refuted, etc., etc. The trouble is, although that is the case, the way it happens is nothing like as clear-cut as it should be. And I'm hoping to show over the next few slides why that's getting to be a real problem. So we found, in terms of the papers themselves, even whatever people have found about that work subsequently, they don't choose to put comments on the papers themselves, although they have the facility to do so. So this appetite for post-publication peer review is non-existent as a routine, as far as we can see. It doesn't mean that within the labs it isn't happening, it's just that it's not getting communicated publicly. Occasionally, very exceptionally, a very active blog discussion ensues. A science paper on arsenic biology of organisms was completely hammered within a very few days of publication by virtue of a very intense blog discussion. And that, I think, was stimulated not so much by the paper itself, but by the way NASA chose to really give it very, very big PR. I think a lot of people got upset by that, so they took to the blogs to fight back, as it were, and to show that it was basically wrong. Now, what else happens? So papers are just wrong, right? I mean, they get published and they get wrong, and it just turns out that they're wrong, and that's the natural scientific process. And if I asked my editors, which I did not too long ago, what they would estimate if you looked at an issue of Nature 4 years on, you know, how many of them over a year would turn out to be wrong? Their estimate is anything between 5 and 10%. In certain discipline, people would say, out there in the field, I've heard say 50%. So, you know, that's not in some cases, that's not a criticism of the work. It is natural when you're looking at very complex systems or using very complex equipment that you can produce results that are just honestly wrong, and they fall into, as it were, not disrepute so much as just get ignored as time goes by. There are some papers that may refute a stream of previous work. There are some papers that turn out to be frauds, as I've said. Some papers make a splash but are quickly refuted. So these sorts of processes are out there. The question I want to finish with, but it's quite a big question, is how we really deal with the problem, those areas where the rate of failure is not natural. It is actually the result of pathological pressures within the system. This is just a paper that you might want to read. Adam Marcus and Ivan Oransky, who are the people who work on Retraction Watch. And they're making a point which I agree with in principle, which is that we need to make these histories visible on the papers themselves. So that you shouldn't just publish it and let go. You should somehow bring readers' attention to the fact that there is something substantial happening afterwards, whether it's positive or negative, in fact, but especially when it's negative. And I guess the rest of this talk is sort of implicitly going to look at why that's not so simple. I wanted to, although this is a very long quote, I'm going to read it out because it actually, I think, beautifully encapsulates one of the problems that we're facing. So this is how to motivate, publish, and highlight, i.e. put on the paper, the fact that it's been either replicated or refuted later on, especially refuted. So because I'm dealing with this the reproducibility issue, I've been talking to people, and this guy who I'm not going to identify, but a Nobel laureate, sent me, an experimental biologist, sent me his view about the problem. He said, I hope I'm stating the obvious to say that some published results are robust, they are reproducible, they hold up under reasonable variations of experimental conditions, other research groups can build on them, they become part of the fabric. Other published results are not able to be replicated in other labs. Rarely they are fraudulent, but more often they are either sloppy or can only be reproduced under very special conditions, or cannot be reproduced even in the original lab, which of course is desperate to prove their reproducibility and tries very hard to do so. But they do not impede scientific progress very much, because if no one can build on them, they just fade away. That's an optimistic statement, but that's what he says. We recently spent a year trying to reproduce an exciting discovery published in Nature. He then gave the details. The Harvard lab that led the original study worked very hard to help us reproduce it. There was a key control experiment in the Nature paper that validated their results, or so it seemed, but in our hands the control always gained the same results as the experiment, disproving the author's finding. So people in the field want us to publish our disproof of the Harvard results, but of course it's much more difficult to disprove than to make a novel claim in the first place, and disprovers get little respect and tend to lose friends. So we're trying to make a positive story out of this and plan to publish a paper in which the disproof is short and the positive extension is the main point. But did this hurt science? Not much, I think. It was frustrating, but life goes on. We will certainly contact the Harvard group before we publish the refutation, but I can almost predict their response. Please do some more experiments. I'm sure we can get it to work. The embarrassment factor is a strong incentive not to retract. And remember, we're talking here about papers in Nature and other top journals. This is not an issue that I'm relating in relation to other papers. It is the papers where you put a lot of, your institution has celebrated you, you've probably already got another grant on the basis of the paper, etc. So there are real social pressures not to do the honest and open thing. So providing a publication channel, so forgetting those negative incentives for a moment, even if you are positively incentivized, where do you publish refutations? And here I think journals have to put up our hands and say we're a bit guilty. But providing a publication channel in an original journal and or elsewhere will take more effort from publishers and editors, somehow to provide a facility by which people can do it. It sounds so obvious. The truth of the matter is we too have our pressures. Not to deny that the experiment we published was wrong. I emphatically say that we absolutely will publish a retraction the moment we validated it, no question at all. But in terms of just a refutation that is done by somebody which is contestable, which is going to get you into a huge debate, and then to give it the same primacy as the original Nature paper is something that isn't easy, although we have absolutely done it on occasion. It just comes with loads and loads of baggage. I was talking to another journal editor this afternoon who said he'd taken 2 years to get a retraction actually eventually accepted. Formal misconduct investigations will sometimes lead to retractions, but many papers that have been shown to be fundamentally flawed will not be explicitly refuted even if a channel exists, i.e. they won't be publicly explicitly refuted for all the reasons I've given. and in practical terms it's challenging for explicit refutations to be identified and highlighted. What I mean by that is that when that author, that Nobel laureate who contacted me, does publish his paper, and I don't know where he's going to publish it, I've asked him to let me know when it is published, there, buried in the result, will be this refutation of the Nature paper. So how would we have spotted that? If we decided to have a policy that we will link from the original paper to that refutation, and it's been peer-reviewed, so it has credibility, you know, how would we have spotted that if he hadn't happened to tell us that he was going to publish that? So to make those refutations visible, even when they do appear, is something that we need to think through how to try and do that. Of course, the papers, if the practice grows of doing that, those who do publish the refutations can then draw it to our attention. So, you know, it's not impossible, but at the moment it is not easy to do that. So the fundamental problem of irreproducibility, which I want to finish on, what are the manifestations of this problem? It is a growth in formal corrections, not retractions, I would say, but in the number of corrections we have been publishing, especially in the biomedical research area. In fact, I would say, in terms of our experience, exclusively in the biomedical research area, but some of the pressures that are at work here are absolutely not restricted to biomedical research. There have been failures to replicate good, apparently, good papers published in high-impact journals, very heavily peer-reviewed, failures to replicate that by biotech and pharma companies who need to replicate and test these results before deciding whether to base drugs or other products on them. And there's a growth in the public discussion about the issue. So we've published a number of papers, and so have Science and other articles. So this is one of the first papers to discuss the problem from a pharmaceutical company's point of view, which was published in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery. I've got all the references here if people want them. This is Science's special issue on data replication and reproducibility that was published, I think, in December last year, where they get into some of this. This is a comment we published, which I think proved a real trigger for debate and discussion by Berkeley, who used to work at Amgen, a biotech company, Lee Ellis, who works in the MD Anderson Cancer Center. So it was a combination of biotech and academic type expertise commenting on this problem and highlighting everything that was wrong in the papers that they were looking at. They reported 53 landmark studies they reported as having replicated or failed to replicate, and I think they only were able to replicate 11% of those studies. So it's a very high failure rate in that particular case. There's debate about that. They didn't actually supply the studies. I can explain why later on if you want. There's a whole issue there too. We've just published this perspective, which is after a community meeting, if you want to call it, by one of the NIH institutes, which gives recipes for how papers can get better. But if you look at those recipes, it's going to take a lot of work. Academics are going to have to do a lot of work. Referees are going to have to do a lot of work. Editors are going to have a lot of work to raise the rigor of biomedical research reporting. So there is a real burden ahead of us to really improve what is undoubtedly a shameful lack of rigor in the literature. So, you know, nobody's saying that there isn't a problem there. These are just, I just wanted to give examples of what you might think are very basic requirements. You know, randomization, you need to randomize your experiments in the lab. You need to blind them. You need to do replication. You need to do independent replications. Well, okay, so that all sounds straightforward until you work out just what it takes to do a replication of some of these experiments. It's big, big money, big time, and therefore, you know, just the mere fact of making that a requirement will be a major challenge in many cases. There is also the it pays to be sloppy question, which is, I found a really interesting result. I've looked at it 3 times. I've looked at the result. It looks okay. I'm going to send it to a high-impact journal because it looks like an interesting result. I know if I went again and replicated it, it just might go away, but I don't think I have the time. And the way that's been said, it characterized to me, is it pays to be sloppy, because you then go ahead, the referee system does not pick up the shortcomings of the work, the editors don't pick it up, it gets published, you get your next grant because you've got a Nature paper, and then it's only 2 years later you're forced to retract the damn thing, you know? So it pays to be sloppy, even though in the end, and then when you retract it, do you suffer a lot? Not necessarily. So that whole sociology is something that I think a lot of us are just really having to get to grips with more and more at this stage. The only other thing to say, however, is that if you have an expectation that actually the way a natural science laboratory works, especially in biology, where you're looking at very complex systems, very complex organisms, including humans, using very complex equipment, is it actually better just to accept the high refutation rate, provided you then can publish the results of refutations later on? I.e., just don't invest on the strength of one paper in Nature. Don't be that foolish. Accept that there is a high failure rate of reality in these experiments, because that is the way science is. And that is indeed a partial answer to the problem, that people have just got to get real about what you can do in science. But the underlying issues are undoubtedly include inadequate rigor, inadequate care. So we're raising awareness, we're organizing meetings, we're conducting, we're publishing stuff, we're developing editorial checklists, we will produce guidance for authors, we'll produce guidance for referees. These are the articles that I've highlighted, and one or two others there, so just to show that they are being published. All the issues that I see as part of all of this, there are all the questions of experimental design, the statistical, good quality statistics is surprisingly in short supply. In biology labs that have been built on qualitative studies, showing that there is an effect of some sort, but not nevertheless having to get quantitative and statistical. So there is a lack of training in the community. The problems of false positives and big data I've not said anything about, but it sometimes just takes tacit expertise. The problems in gels and microscopy images where you just want to fudge them a little bit to make them absolutely clear. Reagents validity, animal studies descriptions, it goes on and on. Data deposition, is the data available? IP confidentiality, are universities holding back some of their replicable agents, if you like, because of IP? Where do you publish refutations? The problem of lab supervision, lab training, and the pressure to publish, it pays to be sloppy. In my view, those last four are the things that are going to prove the most difficult to really bring a change about. And this is my last slide, and I'm going to leave those up in red as the issues which, above all, we somehow need to just get to grips with. I was talking to a science advisor in Norway recently, a government science advisor, about labs he's visited as an inspector, as it were, going out on review visits. And he mentioned one very prestigious lab in the Middle East, where in Israel, in fact, where it's got a very good name, and yet the pressure to publish is very, very intense, to an extent that he remarked during his visit he felt was dangerous. I've talked to young postgraduates who feel the pressure they're being put under to publish interesting results is almost unethical. We're hoping to try and explore some of that in Nature. So that is a key issue. But it's easy to wave your hands about. The question is, how do you get to grips with it? So I'm going to leave that for the intelligent listener. Thank you very much.